In 2019, protests broke out in Hong Kong over an extradition bill that would allow alleged criminals to be sent to trial in mainland China. Though the law was eventually shelved, within months the protest evolved into a massive democracy movement in China's last enclave of freedom. This was not the first time that people had taken to the streets, but it could very well be the last. Spread across multiple decades, Hong Kong's political turmoil has left the city divided in two: the blue ribbons, who are supportive of the Beijing government, and the yellow ribbons, who want democracy. Hong Kong's conflict is often told as a very black and white story, but things are not as simple as they seem. Welcome to the Gray Zone. In this limited series, we bring you previously unheard perspectives of Hong Kong's political conflict. With every episode, we'll uncover details of how each piece shapes the city. I'm your host, Teele Rebane, and you're listening to the Curiously Candid Show.
Hong Kong is a major media hub with a vibrant local press and a number of multinational outlets based here, but press freedom has been in steady decline. According to the latest Reporters Without Borders World Press Freedom Index, Hong Kong has fallen from 18th place in 2002 to 80.
In 2018, when a Financial Times journalist was denied a visa, it was big news.
Refusing a visa in this issue to a bona fide journalist working for one of the world's leading newspapers sets a terrible precedent for Hong Kong's reputation.
Freedom of press is enshrined in Hong Kong's constitution. It's one of the things that sets Hong Kong apart from mainland China.
When Hong Kong's top leader, Carrie Lam, unveiled the law on July 1, she promised that the city would continue to enjoy the freedom of speech, freedom of press, of publication, protest, assembly, and so on. But what followed were a number of moves against the press.
But nobody had any idea just how quickly things would change. The government and pro-Beijing groups have repeatedly targeted the media, accusing it of biased coverage of the 2019 protests. Since then, the media landscape has been dismantled piece by piece. A local tabloid newspaper, Apple Daily, got its offices raided. The public broadcaster, RTHK, underwent a massive editorial overhaul, cancelling shows and deleting old content online. Bao Choi, an investigative reporter, found herself convicted of violating the road traffic ordinance for accessing public license plate records online. And there's even been talk of a Singapore-style fake news law. Months of protests and government aggression have made their mark on journalists, who have been expected to remain objective and neutral in their reporting despite everything that has happened. Today, we talk to Jasmine Leung, a Hong Kong born and raised journalist who spent months covering the protest. This is the third episode of a 5-part series, so if you haven't heard the previous episodes yet, you might want to go listen to them first. How do you distinguish between your identity as a Hong Konger and as a journalist?
I grew up in a very different background because when I was graduating in kindergarten, there was SARS. And when I graduated in primary school, there was swine flu. When I graduated in high school, there was umbrella revolution. And when I graduated at university, there were protests, the anti-ELAP protests. So we were called by a cursed generation. And I often feel I very belong to this term because it feels like there's nothing good happen to me and Hong Kong when it comes to big life events. But I always remind myself, because articles are going to be read by different people, like people who may not know about Hong Kong. And it is actually your duty as a person to introduce the place objectively. I'm Jasmine. I'm a graduate from HKU for journalism. I'm a freelance journalist in Hong Kong. My work can be found in AFP, NBC, and The Telegraph. I love podcasting, and you guys can check out my mental health podcast from the Wallflowers.
Did you always want to become a journalist?
Yes and no, because my parents would not support me to become a journalist. And I thought about journalism when I was in primary school, but I didn't think it's a good way for Hong Kong. Especially, I don't think Hong Kong has freedom of being a journalist.
Already back in primary school, you thought that?
I think the future is not as good as people think. Like, you'll have overtime work, and it was very cheap pay. By the end of my final year, I feel like I really want to become a journalist.
What changed in the 4 years then?
I wanted to contribute to society in a way that is using my strength. I love interviewing people, I love storytelling. I love different forms of media like podcasting. So that's why I realized there were lots of opportunities in the journalism world, so I end up here.
So in 2014, during the Umbrella Movement, you were not working as a journalist in any
I
capacity.
was a secondary school student in my final year as well. I went to the protest just for once, and we were singing the song peacefully in Admiralty. But I also helped the class boycott at my school. I belong to a government school, so it was really risky for me to do so.
Do you think that journalism can be a type of activism too?
I continuously asked this question to myself when I was reporting protests, but my answer was no. I'm presenting both sides. So my duty was to present you the reality, the facts, but not whether you're accepting which side to stand by.
During the protests in 2019, the pro-democracy side was definitely making a lot more noise. So at that time, how could you present the other side fairly as well?
During the protests, for a lot of reporters refused to cover the other side, like the pro-Beijing side. I went there for the protest, for their own protest. They're raising flags, and I got pushed by the crowd, and because they were calling me fake journalist, I came from a British media, and they thought I was saying some bad things about them. And nowadays, I would really yearn for chances to talk with them. And I don't feel afraid of reaching them as well, because I truly believe their voices deserve to be heard. And it was very important for society to accept their voice as well.
Despite the harassment, you kept going back. Why?
It was very interesting. It was an eye-opening experience for me to report on that side, because it was not a minority, but a group that has been silenced by newspapers and radios. So I really wish that I could present that side as well, just to make it a very balanced report. I kept talking with them. I kept finding the real answer behind their motives, but I still couldn't understand it until I had a really deep talk with them.
There was a lot of talk at the time about journalists also covering the Yellow Ribbon protests more because there was more action, there was more blood, there was more tears, there was more fire. Do you think there's some grounds to that?
I think the trend of journalism these days was to get catchy stuff, because you want views, you want clicks, and as long as you got like tear gas or you got a mother shouting, then you probably got a lot of retweets. And I think sometimes of the reporting of the protest coverage, there were a lot of misunderstandings. Like, there were a boom of new online media, and some of them were not trained professionally. They were just amateur journalists, and they would not know the ethics. Like, they were taking a very big shot of injured person mugshot, or probably they were live recording a possible suicide scene. But this is not what journalism is supposed to be. I think sometimes journalism is boring because sometimes facts are really boring, and that's how we do the job.
Things escalated on October 1st, 2019. While China celebrated its National Day with a military parade, protests erupted all across Hong Kong. Thousands took to the streets peacefully at first, but things soon became violent. A little after 4 p.m. that afternoon, news spread across the city that somebody had been shot. Sang Chu Kin, who was 18 years old at the time, was shot in the chest at point-blank range in the Tuen Wan district. It was the first time in 4 months of protests that the police had used a live round on somebody. A police spokesperson later commented that they really did not want to see anyone being injured. They warned quote-unquote rioters to stop breaking the law immediately, as they will strictly enforce the law. Here's a New York Times report on it.
It marks a major escalation, the first time an officer fired a live round at a demonstrator since protests began almost 4 months ago.
You were there in Tuen Wan that day, right?
When it came to October the 1st, I was in Tuen Wan, and after I realized I captured the first protester who got shot by the police right in the chest, I realized it was really dangerous. And it was overwhelming.
Yeah, because I saw that photo when I was looking at your portfolio the other day, and I was like, no way, this is the photo that I've seen absolutely everywhere of the first person to be shot in Tuen Wan. How did you feel later when you found out what had happened to the kid that you took that photo of?
I returned home and thought about whether I should publish the photo through my agency, because there would be a lot of questions asking from the public whether he is holding a sharp object or whether he's holding something plastic or metal. And why would you take this photo out of nowhere? Because it was just single protester. And then I asked myself, what is the role of journalism? It's to present the truth. So I declined any interviews when they asked me about what really happened on that day. So it was really a true moment when I reflect on myself, whether I did it right for this protest or not. But eventually, I feel like I did the right decision.
What was the feedback that you got when you put that photo out?
I got my photo on New York Times, and I was like, oh my gosh, it was something big. But then I just think like I'm just doing my role. So I don't feel very happy or sad about this photo. I was just think I'm really lucky to get it.
The protests reached their climax on November 18, 2019 with the siege of PolyU, when thousands of protesters found themselves trapped inside a fortified university campus surrounded by police. The siege went on to last 12 days and saw over 1,100 people get arrested. Here's the BBC's report.
The young protesters began streaming down the stairway that on Sunday was set aflame to block the police storming the campus. But seconds later, riot police began firing tear gas grenades, sending the young protesters scattering in confusion. Some did not escape. The clear message from the police today: if you surrender, you will be arrested.
I was at the campus at that time, and protesters were being so nice to you. They would say like, you should have the meal first before us. Oh, you got the water, you can have the water, have all of it. And we were embraced by protesters from the pro-democracy side, and I was deeply touched by them. But I always tell myself that I'm a single entity. So I try not to be engaged into the emotional conversation with the protesters. I try to put aside my Hong Kong identity. And by the time on that special night, at 10 p.m., there was a call from the police that they were trying to evacuate all the people from the campus, or else they will be using the lethal weapon. And I was out, and I was a bit panicked because I was a freelancer. And I wish I could stay there longer with the protesters to know about what really happened after the attacks, after the protest things happened. I couldn't witness some important moments, like people were in the drainage and swimming for escape. They were doing abseiling as well. But by the time when I returned to the campus, trying to get into campus on the other day, I was on the highway, and my Uber stopped because we saw a lot of people running towards us. There were the people from the campus, there were protesters, there were first aiders. There were different kind of people from the campus, and they were running towards us. and they were trying to escape. It was in the afternoon, and it was the first batch of people who escaped from the place. I saw it, I got the photo, I got the video, but I decided not to publish them.
So why exactly did you decide not to show it or not to share it?
Part of the journalism world is to, for me, I feel like it's not about activism, but rather of being good or wrong. I would report the features of that later on. I would tell people about this incident, but why I didn't do that at that time is because I feel like they need this. This is the only escape route for them, and this is out of humanity reason to protect them.
So you didn't share them in case somebody would see them and shut down that escape route for the protesters. Do you think that choosing to do so kind of made you pick a side?
I don't think so. I think I would do the same for the different side as well. But it's a really good question to wonder whether you are really into one side, but I know that I'm not. Well, I had a really big problem. I think I have a problem that were not discussed before. I went to the exit because I wanted to get my passport. I lost my identity card, and then I asked my friend to pick it up, my passport from home, because they were saying like without your identity card, they would treat you as rioters. And then I went to the exit on my own without a bag, without my equipment. I went there alone, and then just my wallet, and they were saying like, why were you here? The police were asking like, why were you here? They're yelling, they're shining their torch towards me, and they need to search the stuff in my hands or my little waist bag. And then they asked me, where do you come from? Like, what media are you from? And at that time, I've got like different press cards because I was working for freelancer. And then they just said they haven't heard about the press names. And they said, I'm going to charge you for being a writer. And then I was asked to sit aside and wait for further instructions. But then there was a senior officer from PPRB, which is the Public Communication Branch, and he saw my documents and he said, oh, she's from notable media. We have to let her go. And I was being let go.
Hong Kong police say they want to weed out what they say are self-proclaimed reporters who assault and obstruct officers. So will only now acknowledge journalists who are registered with the government or from what it calls internationally recognised and renowned media outlets.
And afterwards, I feel really guilty of leaving my stuff, leaving my journalism friends, or leaving the whole protest in Polytechnic University, because I don't think my freedom of access should be determined by whether I belong to a notable media or not. And I think without the agreement of that senior officer at that time, I would be in jail. Afterwards, I went out from the protest. My friend got my call, and then he also left the place. He got my bag, and then my bag has had extra panties and bras because I was afraid of water cannon. I was always had an extra clothes, and then my friend told me they got all my stuff to put on the ground, and then they were playing with my bra and said like, oh, you should ask your friend to wear your bra and go to protests and report the protests. And I was really infuriated after I knew this, but we don't have any evidence.
Could you clarify that? So your friend grabbed your stuff, your backpack,
yes,
and took it out of PolyU, and then on his way out of PolyU, everything he was holding, including your stuff, got searched.
Yes.
And they found your spare set of clothes, and the police officers were playing around with your underwear?
Yes.
How do you think, well, since you did an entire podcast on mental health, how do you think it affected your mental health?
I think it gave me some PTSD, definitely. And then also for the Polytechnic University. And I got really bad nightmares, like afterwards. Like I got I got chased by police, and then I was being pushed by them. I had to seek medical help for better sleeping drugs because I couldn't sleep, or I would just hear bang, bang, bang in my dreams. And for me now, I would not stare at Polytechnic University. I would not go to the same place again. I would not travel to the same highway where I saw the people escaped, because I felt really guilty of not doing the best of me to report the protests back then. And I think it's really bad because you couldn't talk to everyone about this experience. People may not understand, or they have something preoccupied with other stuff. My parents wouldn't understand. My parents would say the job was too dangerous, you should really quit it. And I was lucky to have a bunch of journalists who share the same experience, a very supporting circle for all of us to reflect on our work and reflect on our emotions, whether we did it right or wrong, or whether we did it the best or not.
Do you think the way that the media covered the Hong Kong protests affected the way that the protest actually went or progressed or ended?
I think so. I think because there were a few very pro-democracy newspapers in Hong Kong, and then they were having live recordings, and then they would show the surroundings happening around the place and give protesters some time to realize which place would be safe for them. And I think definitely that played on the protester side, but also the same happened to the police side. They were using the live recordings to see where they can arrest the people.
Do you think that journalists play God?
In Hong Kong, I think the government still play the role of God, because we have a very Chinese community background, and people are more respectful to hierarchy.
The events of 2019 and 2020 and the consequential government actions have had an alarming effect on local media.
Journalists are under, say, direct physical threats, and that will cause damaging impact on them. Feels more fears and feelings of white terror among journalists and in doing their work.
Journalism practices have changed so drastically that previous rules of conduct have become nearly obsolete. From accessing public records to tiptoeing around the national security law, Hong Kong journalists have had to adapt to an entirely new playing field. How do you think your work has changed since 2019 or even since you studied journalism in university?
I became more aware of my stance, whether I would reveal my emotions in the article or in podcasts. I'm working recently on the post-protest period where the national security law was implemented. I'm working on a podcast with my company now. And then I kept on asking myself, because for me, I feel threatened by the law. I think it made Hong Kong not a safe place anymore. So I need to ask myself whether I reveal this side of me on my reporting, because that would be biased. And there's like a Reddit-like forum in Hong Kong called LHKG. So they really got into your tweets, your posts, and they would dig up the whole profile if they don't like you. So sometimes I feel like if I said any wrong things, my family would be involved as well.
So you've decided not to reveal in your day-to-day reporting that
Exactly.
You are afraid. But how long do you think you will realistically be able to stay objective?
I think before I become a mother.
Before you become a mother?
Yeah, I think feels would change when you become a mother, but there's still a long way for me to go there.
What do you think will change then?
I think I would be more compassionate towards the protesters, because you really think that they're the future generation of your civilization.
What do you think? What role do journalists play at large in the Hong Kong conflict right now?
They have to support society in defending people's freedom of speech and expression, because they're the amplifier for telling people what people think about society or think about different development. And yeah, I think it's probably the last resort of democracy as well.
Do you have hope for the future?
Not really.
None at all?
Not at all.
Not for Hong Kong?
Not for Hong Kong.
Not for journalism and free media?